Hi, Jeff. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Angus. We're using a
We-
new format, and I'm trying to get my tile correct. Well, I'll just have to be small in my own eyes. Ah,
You use the pin, or if you use pin, and then you'll get to like a proper size.
perfect. A
Okay.
half-naked boy traveling through for.
Yeah, I was reading an article about a scientist and belief. This to do with our whole Christianity, it's like theme that we've been dealing with over the last few months. And it was an article about a really well-known YouTuber called Andrew Huberman, who I know Matt, for example, has talked about before in his podcast. My daughter even knew about him. He's a little bit similar to Jordan Peterson in the sense that, but he's coming really from the neurological chemical side, so like healthy living for people, in the same way that Jordan Peterson was like really like trying to talk more specifically to men, I believe, but with an openness there about getting people to take themselves seriously, their bodies and their minds. And so he's one of these really influential. I think he's got about 5 million subscribers. And in this article, which I'll link in the post below, there was lots of interesting things said, and I'm not going to read the whole article. I'm going to just sort of like read a little bit, and I think that'll lead us into a conversation about why is believing amongst scientists, believing in God, and perhaps even more specifically with Christianity, when we look at some of the people we look at, is it becoming more acceptable, or are those voices becoming louder in that space? There, I think this is the question that I'm interested in. So yeah, let's start with reading a little bit and see where it takes us in a conversation. We haven't planned anything here, but I think we both feel a desire to talk about this in a contemporary context, as opposed to sort of like the Christianity as mystical fact, which is what we've been looking at in our other series. So from this article, which is from, it's called godreports.com. I'd never seen it before. It says, in recent years, scientists are increasingly vocal about their faith in God, insisting that the dazzling display of creation is too overwhelming, complicated, and precise to have been spontaneously generated. And they talk about how James Tour and Francis Collins as other examples there. Huberman then goes on to say, I'm not the first to say it. Einstein believed in God. Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychologists ever, clearly believed in God. And he's using the authority model to justify his belief, or that's the way it's being presented in this article. Um, so some of your thoughts on what's going on with Huberman here, and so the space that you're also watching in your with the podcasts.
Well, first of all, I listened to a conversation that happened about a year ago with Huberman and Peterson, and it was fascinating. It was really good. It was Jordan Peterson at his best when he's really focused on his understanding his discipline, and he's a psychologist, so that discipline is also is both clinical and theoretical psychology, I'd say, which is and he's fairly phenomenological about it, so it sort of brushes against the sort of the the phenomenological reality of the spiritual, I would say. It's a way for me to put that, not to put words in his mouth, but that's my experience of it and why I find it relevant. Um, and he's a thinker, which we know is spiritual activity. So he's existentially abutting the spiritual world as we have tried to describe it and experience it and understand it. Um, and he's transdiscipline in his understanding. Like he can go with a neuroscientist, which is what Huberman is, and he has his own lab,
That's
and
right.
that lab is concentrated very much on as you've mentioned, performance, which is why the appeal to the sort of Jocko Willin, Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan, these
Yeah.
folks who really tend to appeal to men because it's really about optimizing. It's a lot about optimizing physical well-being and strength. And I also think that there's obviously something to naturalism that both of them are steeped in that
Yeah.
brings you close to the spiritual reality. Like the Christianity we're talking about isn't a religion. It's a phenomenological reality that people are going to be coming into relationship with if they are working um, if they are working genuinely and without presumption and increasingly not falling into the old world, not the old world, the modernist paradigmatic mind, if they're able to break those frames, so to speak. And then further, I'll just say right now, I was listening to Vervaeke and Jordan Hall, two conversations in which they're actually coming. Jordan converted to Christianity recently, and he is Jordan Hall, and he is a very considerable thinker who has influenced a lot of these people through deep and intimate, engaging conversations over time and relationally. And so he's sort of an undercurrent in relationship to the dark web, so to speak. He's connected to a lot of our of people adjacent to us, let's say that, and influential there. And he has his conversion, may have startled somebody like Vervaeke, who grounds his uh, naturalism, although a transcendent naturalism, grounds reality in that in a naturalism, what Bonnie Roy, I think, might call fierce naturalism. And um,
Yeah.
and so I think what's very fascinating about all of this, despite the triviality of that article, you know what I mean? It sparks the reading that article really sparks one to say, well, actually, what's going on here? Is it actually that scientists see the beauty of nature and its miracle, and say, well, there's got to be a God, and I have to believe in that God, and it's just a pragmatic thing, or it's a thing that, right? And I think there are people who are exploring it in very, very interesting ways, and in ways that are experientially closer and closer to what you and I are trying to articulate here as the phenomena of the Christian experience, say.
Yeah, I think it's important what you're saying, that this isn't in any way sort of trying to knock. It's like what these people are doing, these transformational processes is that they are going through, but we're trying to like see it from another perspective, because we've met. It's like we've commented on Viveki and various conversations happening in this space where people are deeply attached to this natural scientific way, understandably, of understanding the world, and but still believing that that is going to give them it's like a modern way into spirituality. But you and I are coming from this perspective that this, when we're relying on authority, on and the authority of other people, this is one of my problems with the article. If it's good enough for Einstein, if it's good enough for Jung, then I should get on board with it. The perspective that we're trying to play with is that. Sorry, I've got my daughter here, so it's just disturbing me. with this appeal to authority, what we are really interested in is developing this idea that it becomes experiential through a deeper understanding of what the activity of thinking is within us. We don't have to rely on these authority figures, although they are really interesting. They are hugely interesting because from our perspective, what they are doing is they are tapping into a fundamental truth. But as long as we have that sort of like authoritative sort of like aspect to it, it leaves, at least for me, and you can comment on this, it leaves somewhat a bitter taste in the mouth. It's an appeal to authority rather than experience and reason, which is central for the perspective I think we're coming from. Would you agree with that, or would you like to problematize what I just said?
I wouldn't problematize it or even push back on it. I would just say that I don't personally, subjectively, don't have the distaste for the article other in that way, that specific way. More in the way that I described, do I have that? It's sort of bandwagoning. It's a sort of a it's a whatever the intention of the article is quite fine for me. And it's interesting that they bring in it's about Huberman, and they bring in scientists, and they're trying to fix something like a cultural war, something like that. That they're trying to say, see, the scientists are on board with it, so they're, why don't more people come to our church? That's what it smells like to me.
Yes.
But I'm less interested in Einstein and Jung, even, although I'm quite interested in Jung, as people who professed a relationship, whatever that relationship was, with God. I don't know who God is, so every time one brings that up, one has to like define God, and it's an indefinable reality, say. Except that it's experienceable reality through its iterations, right? And we are, as human beings, iterations of that. And so that speaks to a possibility that all of the creation's an iteration. And so, of course, natural science, when it reaches its I don't have the poetic language for it, but when it reaches its, for some reason, the fourfoldness of something is trying to express itself, like the four horsemen of the apocalypse, or the four aspects of the basic structure of existence, from actuality to intentionality to incorporative metamorphosis into inherency, something like that. Some reason that's coming to mind, and maybe it'll come back up again. But what really is, what I think is really going on here is that natural science, if it fully reaches its full potential, which is to understand nature, that there you will find God, so to speak, right? There you will find, and in our language, there you will find the Christ as an evolutionary principle that incarnated into the nature of existence. And so I see people not even trying to convert, who are getting closer and closer to this reality. So I'm listening to, say, Michael Levin and John Vervaeke and Greg Enriquez have a conversation, and Michael Levin's description of biology is as close to a Goethean archetypal picture of the organizing principles grounding into thinking, into cognitive, the ground of being something like cognitive, that no person that we would object to who adopts almost the scientism of our day could I don't know, understand. They certainly couldn't cotton to it, right? What Michael Levin's saying. Yet he's the leading edge biologists, right? And so I see people just getting closer and closer, and the natural scientific frame is adjacent to the anthroposophical spiritual scientific frame. It's a metamorphic moment that needs to occur, and it's occurring in our society right now. Now, whether it'll last, whether it'll have legs, depends on whether we approach it in the way that that article does, or we approach it in the way that helps to foster and cultivate that metamorphosis into a spiritual understanding without the need for belief and without the need for depending on multiple unexamined paradigms, say, or axiomatic simulations that aren't noticed, and that follows, that sort of harkens back to conversations we've had previously.
Yeah, yeah. You said some interesting things. A couple of thoughts that come to mind. At the beginning, you were talking about knowing God. One way that I like to describe it to myself to understand is, and this might sound like semantics, but there's a bigger truth behind it. If the whole of nature is a revelation of God, which is how we see it, then we can talk definitely about God being knowable through the manifestations in nature. But it's not comprehensible in the sense that we're able to understand the whole. So we can look at aspects of nature, and that sort of like that reveals to us an aspect of this whole, and that is knowledge, and hopefully it's true knowledge as well, true justified belief. It's like to use like a Platonic term. But the idea of comprehensibility, that's that infinite that we cannot know. It's the infinite well. It's the ineffable of what God is. Anybody who claims to be able to like give a complete picture there, yeah, they've already lost something, because it goes beyond that.
Can I interject there?
Yeah, go for it.
This is one of the things that I think that I find inspiring and leads me to see the integrity of the folks that I think most highly of in this regard, because I forget who it is, the scholar who defines or describes finite games and infinite games, and that you can't have a real relationship with reality as a totality without understanding that there's an infinite game that we're playing. Yeah. And that is a frame breaker right there, right? Because conventional thinking and sense bound thinking, which is part and parcel of conventional thinking, binds us to find a finite game. It binds us to finitude as sort of snapshot reality, and so there's not a proper context with which to come into terms with what you're describing as wholeness, unity, universality, these sorts of things, and let alone any personal avenue to come into deep relationship with a universality, right? Because never the twain shall meet, right? So I just wanted to interject that's part of the thing that's occurring in this conversion space, where Jordan Hall has actually gone from a natural scientific, I would say, dyed in the wool, sort of. I never really loved his work until now, not because he converted to Christianity and he agrees with me. Like, he doesn't agree enough with me yet, but for my joy for his existence, not for me personally. But what happened is a humility switch went on, and so he's no longer full of himself in a way that I always thought he was, and it was just hard for me. I would never choose to look at his material unless he was talking to somebody like Zach Stein, for example, Right, and there's some of that, or Schmachtenberger, or that sort of thing. I find humility in their work. I find humility in John's work, and suddenly it's like a switch went off, and he's experiencing what he said was through a process of humiliation in a certain sense. I don't know anything about that, and he didn't detail it, but there is the humility as the sort of foundation for to be able to come into deep personal intimacy with that which is universal, which is an experience. And you're right, it's not, there's a reason why that which is unnameable is is the God that people are referring to.
Yeah. Coming back to what you were saying a few minutes ago about fourfoldness, one of the thought trains that you set off in my head was this conversation about the limits to knowledge and it is intimately linked to like what we actually think or believe thinking is. And if we come from a Kantian nominalist perspective, then this intimately linked to that perspective is the thought that thoughts are just thoughts. They are not real. And this is where the fundamental, or part of where the fundamental shift has to happen, a reappreciation of what this activity of thinking is within us. And once that begins to shift, then this idea of limits to knowledge, that sort of like we can only know what we sort of like see and observe and can measure, it becomes sort of like a tiny little part of the pie. It becomes such as like a narrow field of research. And we see with different research methodologies how they try to sort of like tackle this problem with longitudinal research and all these type of things, because they recognize that there is an understanding within the scientific community that we need different methodologies to get at these complicated aspects of the human being. But what we're referring to is a fundamental appreciation of what is the origin of a concept, this intuitive capacity that lives within us, and how is it that we connect that to and actually restore the unity of experience. It's like ourselves living within the whole, the participation that Owen Barfield specifically, and not restricted to him, is like often very keen to emphasize this idea of we are living within, we are participating in nature, we are integral to it. We're not individual cells bumping up against each other, so like with no knowledge of the whole context in which we live. And that's those type of conversations become, and someone like Michael Levin becomes, it's like very interesting, because he really is pushing the boundaries. He's like saying, if you look at this research, this means one of the things that it forces us to do is like to reconsider this whole DNA idea. To what extent is it linked to like physical manifestation? It's not so much denying like what we do know about DNA, but it's nuancing the debate and like saying, well, how do these changes come about? If there is no DNA change, we're missing an important part of the puzzle. So it is interesting and wonderful to see this type of research going on that pushes the boundaries of knowledge, but also forces us to expand our idea on like what life is, and these truths that exist within science about DNA, problematizing them and saying, to what extent are they true? And that's where I find his work of great value. But there's what are your own thoughts on? So I'm going to mention a few names here and see where it leads us. So when when I was thinking about what we might talk about today, I was looking for other celebrities that like have also been seem to be being drawn into this reaffirmation of faith or belief, and often within Christianity. And you've got people like Jim Carrey is a really interesting figure. He had his break with Hollywood like back in about 2018. Although I believe he still somehow back, but he has been a lot more vocal about both the importance of faith, the corruptness of Hollywood, and also the specifically with him, you've got this Christian aspect going on. Huberman, he's less. He'll admit, he's like recognize. He says like he's reading the Bible to understand his beliefs better, but he doesn't like commit to Christianity. You got Jordan Peterson, who I'd love you to say. I'd love it if you'd tell us more about that aspect. He's quite clearly been on this. What is religion? What is faith? What is Christianity? Trained for many years now with his own personal battles and inquiries into it. And then you've got another sort of like giant out there, it's like in the podcast sphere, which is someone like Joe Rogan. Now he hasn't come out and said he's Christian, but I've also noticed how there is an increasing openness in the people that he's inviting in for conversations to talk about their beliefs, and Christianity is one of these questions that comes up time and time again. So he'll be talking to atheists and what this atheist experienced, so that he or she like fundamentally changed their understanding of what life was. And Jim Carrey certainly doesn't fall into this category, but one of the things that I think has part of this, what I perceive as a renewed vigor in the faith science debate, is the pandementia that we went through in 2020 is bringing people out of the woodwork and realizing there is something in this world that we have to combat. And even someone like Brendan, who we talked to, and John and Greg and Zach in their conversations, the importance of values, so the moral life, the how essential it is to have them within. It's like a well-functioning society, and what happens when they fall apart, when they crumble in the face of darker forces. Yeah. What would you think? Do you think something is happening, or are we just imagining this because we've been doing our series and we've got our own interests there? So hold that question. I'm going to give one specific example of this pandementia angle that I was talking about. So at the beginning of the pandementia, one of the people that was really, really interesting for trying to get some facts, some science around the question, not the stuff that was being like shown on mainstream, but there was a guy called Reinhard Fulmich. And he was really, really hot on like what the PCR is and different aspects. And he's, by the way, he's the guy that sued VW for the diesel emissions thing. So it's like a powerful voice, like in the legal sphere, and a recognized voice. And I've been following his conversations with lots of different people with areas of medical expertise. I met someone like Desmet's ideas of what's that group? The term doesn't.
Mass psychosis.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, mass psychosis. I met that concept through him, and then I was able to go deeper. But at some stage, the conversation turned very spiritual. So I'm talking about 6 9 months into this journey of discovery, it became clear that and he was using these words himself. This is a hard-boiled lawyer, so like saying there's a spiritual dimension to what is going on there, and he recognized that he hadn't seen that before, and increasingly he was talking with people that were coming at it from that spiritual perspective. So this is it's a mixture of all of these different influences that are like that are weaving this idea together. That really this is it's like 2020. It's like was the start of a serious spiritual battle, and is what I was giving the example: Huberman, Carrey, Rogan, Peterson, and all the names you mentioned. Is this an example of how what we would perceive are healthy spiritual forces are fighting back? What do you think?
Well, I don't know about that last bit. That's intriguing. Zach Steiner wrote the essay "A War in Heaven," which is a beautiful essay. A war broke out in heaven, or something like that. That sort of that essay launched him into this sphere as somebody that should be listened to and should have been listened to before, I imagine. But
just a quickie question: do you know when that was, or what was the title was, so we can sort of like perhaps put a link in the description?
yes, it was. I believe it was pre-pandemic. It's Zach's work is published by Perspectiva. We looked at Jonathan Rausen, who's one of the founders of Perspectiva, and so you can find that information there, and we can link to it later. But the reason why I bring that up is that I think Zach has his. I mean, there's a zeitgeist, right? And I think Michael Levin's work points to, and his notion of light cones points to perspectives that are cognitive, as we would say. There's thinking all the way down, that are more and more expansive in their relationship with goals, is the way he puts it. It's an expensive word as far as I'm concerned, but so their purvey, essentially, their perspective, and what it is they're after. So a fly lives, what,
A few days.
a few days, a matter of hours, relative, right? And so, its perspective is that, right? It has to do with what it can accomplish during that time as a fly, say, something like that. But if you take those light cones and you can logically take them up, rationally take them up and beyond humans, right? And I'm we did that doesn't that's for me. It's like, yeah, actually that's true. What he's saying is true. I think there's some inversion problems there that I maybe we speak to later, that I've been working on. That is to say, that more simple the organism, the more global its perspective, right? It doesn't individuate. It doesn't have an individual agency. Its agency is totality.
Yeah.
And so therein lies where the immanent and the inherent is. What is, I won't let's say, what is immanent within the inherent world, and is part of the evolutionary process, is simple cell organisms as totality, and that also is an aspect of this, right? But my point here is that you really establish a spirit of the time, and so I'll just bookmark that spirit of the time. Okay, there's a spirit of the time that is a supersensible reality, that is a being, a host of beings, one could say, that is profoundly influential, that is influential like some of the great thinkers of our time and other times, that is part of a multiverse of beings that are an extension beyond us, say. And just as I'm a spiritual being, and as a spiritual being, I am grounded in a body, those spiritual beings are grounded in something else, not a body. And so there is a zeitgeist, and I understand the zeitgeist now from this point of view. There's a spiritual reality being addressed that addresses the spiritual individualities that don't incarnate as physical bodies, that wants to be in dialogue with us, that wants to be of service, but but is has no truck if there's nothing to ground that service in. And that's what's happening in our the intelligentsia sphere that we're talking about. That's what's it's happening and then we just all went through something, and I think it's related. I don't think it's necessarily causative, because the way I saw the uh pandementia you refer to, I like that term. uh the way I saw that, the wholesale purchase of foolishness, the follow the science foolishness, we were ripe for that, not because of political ideologies and groupthink and that sort of thing. That's true. That was a preparation for that, to accept the moralizing aspect of the religious flag waving that was occurring as follow the science, but because this is a process of materialism that has culminated in economic exhaustion, um, uh, political ideation exhaustion, scientific exhaustion of dead end presumptions, and uh, and religious exhaustion, and the religious exhaustion has piggybacked on the scientific endeavor in order to legitimize itself. And so it's the four horsemen of the apocalypse, right? Right. And so we're having an apocalyptic moment. No shit. Like that's happening all the time. Religious life is happening all the time. Spiritual life is happening all the time. Of course, it was mentioned in Revelations, right? Because those four horsemen are hanging out all the time, you know.
Yeah.
So so I this is my, I would say, gut answer to your question. Yes, there's something going on. Yes, and everything is a symptom of that which is going on, and it's not, and it's a thinning veil, and that spiritual world is much more available to everyone who is doing earnest work. They don't have to call it anthroposophy. They don't have to call it Christianity. They just have to come into relationship with reality without purchasing the fourfold cul-de-sac of materialism.
I'd like to that fourfoldness that you're emphasizing there. I'd like to emphasize, it's like building on what you're saying there. So the threefoldness of what we are as human beings is one of the things that Steiner talks about, like on multiple occasions, is the importance of the Council of Constantinople in 869. And for those that are not versed in that, when so what happened, that prior to that, so like the Catholic Church, the point of departure is that a human being is body, soul, and spirit, where the soul is the mediator. In one direction, it looks to the material world and it lives in that, and then when it opens its eyes towards the spirit, it also sees the reality there, and it experiences how they are a unity. They are not separate. And at the council in 869, what happens is the church, they sow the beds for materialism, basically saying that the human being is no longer body, soul, and spirit. It is just body and soul with sort of like certain aspects of spirit. And this is symptomatic of what was being, so like humanity was walking away from, or if you want to take a victim perspective on it, you were saying being driven out of by forces. But this essential understanding that we also see when we've been looking at Christianity as mystical fact, this assumption that there is a spiritual world, there is a spiritual reality which underlies the whole of reality. that already in 869 was beginning to be phased out. And this is part of what I see all the people that we've mentioned so far in our conversation, and a lot more beyond, they are trying to wake up. They are trying to get re-enliven having a true understanding of what it means to be a being of body, soul, and spirit, and us living between those two worlds. And this is why we love our conversations. And even though we recognize that Viveki and Brendan and all of these people, that sometimes the conversation is difficult with them because we feel that they're still too directed in one direction, too much emphasis on the natural science aspect, but at the same time a recognition that they are doing hugely important work, because they are pushing the limits, and they are saying, we're not satisfied, there must be something more. And yeah, that's, you talked about Zach Stein's War in Heaven. That's one of the lenses through which I see what is going on. So like in the world at the moment, there's an increasingly, your word exhaustion was so potent. Everywhere, okay, that's an exaggeration, but in so many aspects of society and culture, there seems to be this exhaustion going on. We're running out, and and the only forces full of life seem to be those that want to destroy. It's like what society has created. So there's this desperate need and desire to find healthy forces with which society can have something on which it can base itself. But as long as thinking is based in nominalist Kantian perspective, then it just becomes, we are still only body and soul. We're still stuck in our psyches. Yeah.
Yeah, another phenomenon that's occurred is over the recent years is the notion that there are spiritual beings metaphorically governing the activity. I think, well, it's symbolic, and it's more than metaphor, and they are beings. But there's the notion of the egregore, for example, which is sort of a one-sided picture of a group spirit sort of thing. Right. And so with Rudolf Steiner, we have this very elaborate description of forces that are going on in nature that then are personalized through the human individuation process as luciferic and Ahrimanic. And so they become, in a sense, grounded in human beings as tools. Right. And I would say the human being can become a tool if they adopt instrumentalism, right? They become a simulation, and so they become a technological end or ends. And then there's also I think a spiritual reality going on here that's a lawful one, and it has to do with metamorphosis, right? It has to do with the fact that existence gives rise to its self-governing nature, and it evolves through a process of metamorphosis, right? And if development happens that way, it's happening constantly in our gut biome. It's happening everywhere around us. It's describable, and it's lawful, and we just happen to be agents inside our own metamorphosis. Right, like it's the Kafkan idea, except that Kafka stopped at the door of the threshold. Right, that this picture of this bug. Right,
yeah.
Whereas Michael Levin gives a gorgeous description of the transition from caterpillar to butterfly, not in a merely poetic way, and in ways more scientifically grounded than some of the descriptions before that are metaphors. Like, that's not a metaphor. I mean, what carries forth as the butterfly doesn't resemble at all the being that was the caterpillar, yet it is the same being, right? So and what he argues for is it carries perspective through, not the content of its habits and that sort of thing, because its habits are completely different. It eats different things. It has a different lifestyle. You know what I mean? But it's not a different being. It's a being that has reincarnated as a butterfly, and that's a proper understanding of reincarnation. That happens up and down, all the way down. Leaving aside reincarnation for now, going back to metamorphosis, that there is a law of metamorphosis. And I want to pick up this fourfold body, soul, and spirit thing, because this is where we locate Christ in this process, right? And it's intimated in the butterfly, but I want to try it from a Wittgenstein phenomenology, right? And this isn't Husserlian phenomenology, which is sort of limited itself in worldview. This is an exploration and participation, as Barfield speaks, I believe. So we have bodies, and they're part of the world of appearances, right? And there's all of our scientific endeavor is just about that up till now. And I think we're crossing a threshold with Michael Levin's work, for example, and Tim Jackson's work, the guy that Matt Siegel's talking with about Whitehead.
Okay, didn't know that.
And Matt, from a philosophical perspective, he's already crossed this threshold, I believe. His work about etheric imagination is by all accounts, I haven't read much of it, just referentially, but is for this reason he's crossed this threshold into an understanding of the imaginal as a perception of the spiritual reality of existence, right? And only a perception, right? It's not a higher cognitive function that actually now participates in it, except for subjectively, which is really important. So there's the body, and I got a little that was a little aside, and the body is the world of appearances, as I mentioned, and when we're a body among bodies, and what we do with the self there is largely superficial, as most of our conventional thinking and institutions are and produce superficiality. But it's important, you have a fire, you want to know that you use water to put it out, right? Those are important connections to make. But then there's the fact that that we come into relationship with this has a soul implication, in that our souls are intentionality. They're all intentionality. It's the way in which we are configured in tension with ourselves in the world. And so that creates a form. And then we have to do something with that, right? And then what we do with it is we take up that intention and we work with the polarities that exist between me and the world. And that mediated agency of metamorphic lawfulness, when resolved, turns back into the world as the inherent, which then becomes appearances, but we face with a new kind of understanding, a new kind of relationship, a new kind of intimacy. And this is the process of evolution as I see it, and it's the life of a concept, right? Yeah. And this is the Christ experience. The Christ experience is the metamorphosis out of that which is apparent into that which is no longer apparent but is immanent in nature. And that's why people are coming to this. It's a fact.
Yeah,
it's a fact. And what does mystical mean in the work that we're traversing? It means that which is supersensible. And 3/4 of reality is supersensible. It's not supernatural, right? It's not supranatural. It might be supraconscious, and it's not unconscious for sure. But it incorporates all of those things, and it is being, and it's beings that we come into relationship with. And there's no I mean, we're getting cognitive exploration because we're able to draw in the inspiration from those beings, just as we do with each other.
Your description's reminding me of another picture that you come across occasionally in anthroposophy. And you don't have to be an anthroposophist to accept this. It's just that's where I got the material from. But there's if we look at a plant, and he uses examples like often, it's like we can study it in terms of its nutritional values, and so and the structure of the chemical structure and so like the physical structure and all that type of thing, and those are all real. That's the quarter. But as long as we as long as we remain in that sphere of observation or research, we are continually blind to what is that activity, what is that being that is actually creating the growth. What is it? It's like in that plant that it's like draws the minerals out of the earth, that's like combines them in all these different ways, this real agency that is happening. Instead, it's like the botanist is interested in what that agency has produced, rather than understanding the agency, the activity that is continually, this metamorphosis that is so key to what you're describing here. What is that activity that is shaping the whole time and continually creating growth and evolving through that? And that example with the plant is still, it's like a comprehensible level. I think we can begin to like feel in our minds like the richness of what is that activity. Then when you move up to the animals and then to the human being, that it's like the whole picture becomes sort of like much richer, much more complicated. But I think it's a good, it's a fairly easy place to start. What is really going on in a plant? And I remember the conversation that we never actually published with Brenda because I mucked up on the audio, when we were talking about etheric forces, and he was and people who think like him, they're quite happy talking in terms of like these are just gradients, tension gradients, that's all this is that's producing. So they're sensing a type of agency there. But what spiritual science is about is like saying, recognizing this agency there as something real and fundamental, which is always manifest, but also that if we school ourselves, that these forces are no longer invisible, they actually become researchable. And that's when you enter into what we're looking at, for example, in Matt's latest groups, like with esoteric science. It's like at the second part of that book is like, how do you develop these capacities so that you're not just looking in the mirror, you're not looking at the food values, you're actually able to live within the phenomena so that they start informing you about their own essence.
This is exactly where the intersection with Steiner occurs for me. So you wouldn't ignore Einstein if you were studying the theory of relativity, right? I think what we're seeing is that people are coming closer to the reality that we can know the spiritual rather than have to have a religion instantiated as a belief system and doctrine and that sort of thing. And that there's a lot of wisdom in that tradition that can still be gleaned from the writings and the inspirations coming from the initiates who wrote them. And what we need is new initiates, right? So, Steiner comes along and writes the fifth gospel, for example. So he's contributing to an evolution of the Christian impulse through an articulation, right? It seems presumptuous from an abstract point of view, but when you read the body of Steiner's work, you realize what he's doing is spiritual science. And he went quite a long way down that road as an individual. And as a society, I think we're coming close to picking that up. But the man will have to be taken seriously first. And I understand why it's difficult to take him seriously, but this is why we're why I have so much respect for Matt and his courage within this um, milieu,
Mm-hmm.
and he's admired for his relationship with Whitehead, and Steiner could you could take Steiner's work and incorporate Whitehead inside of it, right? Like like, and I'm not saying that from a like uh, presumed uh, sort of egoistic claim in the stead of Steiner. I'm saying it that it's incorporative because it's metamorphic.
Mm-hmm.
So it's always incorporating, and it's living itself. It's not. It didn't die when Steiner died. He provided a framework for understanding the supersensible world and taking it seriously, and then you don't have to believe it. In fact, it's important you don't believe it, because then you can't experience it as perception, right? You're going to have this cloud of the scrim, a cognitive scrim between you and the world. And I think more and more people are recognizing the problem, like Michael Levin does, with cognitive scrims. We don't
Mm-hmm.
need them. We don't need paradigms, right? We could do, as Jordan Hall calls it, with a post paradigmatic mind. Now, I'm not sure he goes that far, but he certainly uses a non paradigmatic mind as a tool. So say that.
Mm.
Um, but so this is a kind of a plug. We're reading the outline, an outline of spiritual science, written by Steiner as a foundational work, and it should be treated as philosophy of freedom should be treated as a foundational work in relationship to the scientific disciplines. Uh, this then is an extension of one of those disciplines, and it's not chemistry; it's spiritual science. It's the thing that explores that which brings uh, chemical interactions about, right? That is part and parcel of the way existence comes into being, and that's a scientific endeavor. And
Yeah.
but it doesn't it right. I'll leave it at that, because what people call science is all of the instruments and methodologies that are layered on top of, based on a belief system that then has the outcome of essentially producing what it's seeking to prove.
Yeah. Yeah. You said lots of interesting things that have like sparking some thoughts there. Before we come back and look more thoroughly at this non-paradigmatic idea that you were talking about, because I'd like to problematize it, but also like set it in a spiritual science context. Um, but just coming back to this reframing, it's like, what is it that's going on in the world? I think also if people understand how Aristotle like began to swing humanity away from like looking at the world as an expression of spirit and soul, and so like saying, look at matter, let's do some observation there. That's when we can begin to talk about true justified belief. But also Aristotle, we found that a lot of Aristotle's stuff turned out to be based on like poorly informed observations. So a lot of, although it's like Aristotle was the authority in the Middle Ages, this, like you were saying, Steiner is not infallible, but he's the best and the clearest there is up until now. And once people start doing spiritual science, they might start overturning like some of the things that are accepted as truths within spiritual science. I think one of the areas where this might happen is like in research into like incarnations of different people, for example, which he said is exceptionally difficult to follow. I mean, some of the basics, like physical body, etheric body, astral body, eye, that ain't gonna change. I mean, that's sort of like that's like Aristotle, so like saying there's not matter. It doesn't even begin to end to end. So yeah, I wanted to highlight what you were saying there, that this isn't about belief, but it's about having a different paradigm to work from, which allows us to understand the world in different ways that enriches our understanding of the world, and enables us to answer questions that previously you would have to have answered with chance or I don't know. They no longer become I don't know. They no longer become a purely chance. No, these are the spiritual impulses that are driving these processes, and when we understand them more thoroughly, then what appears as random no longer is. But coming back to your point about Jordan Hall, I believe you were talking about with non-paradigmatic perspectives. I think, if I put it like that, I'm not sure that's possible. You always have to work out of a paradigm. However, I mean, one of the things where, again, Steiner is so interesting is the 12 worldviews. Understanding the value of being able to see things, phenomena, events, from multiple perspectives. This idea that's one unique perspective is never going to reveal the richness of what is going on in the events or whatever it is that we happen to be observing. So I would have to listen more to what Jordan Hall means when he says non-paradigmatic. To me, it sounds it sounds to me that there's a lack of understanding of the importance of paradigm. It's as a means of understanding something, rather than realizing that various paradigms, it's realist, nominalist, spiritual, materialist, and the other ones that come up in that series of lectures of worldviews. That's when I think really interesting things begin to happen, and also speaks to the importance of these many conversations that are going on in this space about trying to wake up to what is spiritual, what is it that transforms us. It is, if we're going to get closer to the truth, then what it is we're describing has to be looked at from multiple perspectives. I don't know, what did you have a particular reaction to what you were saying about Jordan Hall and non-paradigmatic perspectives?
Well, I think I'm of two minds about it, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that let's take Michael Levin's thought cone or light cone. We could call it thought cone, actually. I think for me, thought is light and light is thought. And so thinking, meaning process.
Yeah.
The process sense. And we're an odd animal, so to speak, an odd species. We're an odd speciating species in that we think about our life beyond our life. So our perspective, our goals, so to speak, are something like perfection, right? So not bringing the Christ into this, I'll just leave that I'll just leave that there, not bringing the Christ into it. We have this perspective that we what it is to be what it would be to perfect ourselves. We're always trying to transcend that which we are, so much so that we do so generationally, so to speak. And then I'm not going to bring karma and reincarnation into this, but at the same time, that perspective suggests that there are beings that actually are informing us of what that might look like, right? And so I can see a paradigmatic, he calls it, uh, um, human being, if we were both uh, evolved completely and completely universal in our perspective, which we're not. And as long as we're not universal in our perspective, um, then we can't do without paradigms. But what we can do is make all those paradigms as transparent as possible and participate in the way in which we use them as tools. And paradigms are just concepts, right? And just concepts. Oh, well, what's a concept? Well, a concept turns out to be a being that I create, and that one of those beings is myself as concept. And that being has a fourfold nature, and I participate in its coming about. And so I can understand it transparently, just as I can understand the paradigms that affect that being,
Hmm.
right? Through the increased intentionality, hopefully, moving toward a perfected state. So I guess that's my quick and dirty on the paradigm thing. I think we're seeking to not rely on them. We certainly are seeking to recognize them and keep aware of them, lest we believe in things that we don't own responsibility for believing in.
Yeah. Whilst you were talking there, you reminded me. Do you remember when we were doing Truth and Science? I think it was the third or the fourth in that series. We looked at the football match between the English empiricists and the German idealists, with the French football Descartes are like in the middle there. And when this is this has a this is a fruitful game. It's a fruitful conflict, and when conversations are had where it's like the expertise that empiricists can bring that the idealists they're so wishy-washy about, so they bring an element to the conversation that another style of thinking, another worldview, to use Steiner's term, is incapable of bringing to the table, but which is essential for a more complete version of the truth, or a closer approximation to the truth, shall I put it like that. But it's also that it's like in a good conversation, the empiricists will actually say, well, yeah, there are certain aspects that we haven't thought through thoroughly here. And actually, here, the idealists, they really do us a favor because we've made all these assumptions about certain aspects of thinking that we haven't thought through. And just for the sake of completeness, I'd like to I've pulled up the graphic here. So when we were talking about the Steiner's 12 worldviews and like these polar opposites and the usefulness of them, I'd just like to go through the opposites. I mentioned two of the opposites, but there are others to go on to add to that map. So we had the material spirit perspective, the truth in between those two, and idealism and realism, or what was previously called realism and nominalism. But then you've also got like another dimension, which is sensationalism contra psychism. Sensationalism contra pneumatism, and then phenomenalism contra psychism. And then on the other pole, you've got rationalism contra, what would that be, dynamism, and then mathematism contra monadism. And when we begin to understand how all of these perspectives are valid but incomplete when they're not in conversation with all of these other worldviews, that's when we begin to understand the value of these conversations that are going on. And one of the reasons why these 12 worldviews are so interesting to look at, difficult to really come to terms with, but if we can identify within ourselves how we are bouncing around in this sphere, so like bouncing from mathematism to psychism to monadism to recognizing the truths, what they can bring to the table, what our banquet that we've got here. and then so like the human mind can feast on it's like the knowledge that these different worldviews bring to the table.
That's really, really well said. Um, it also sort of puts me in my place as far as the paradigmatic on it. And it's an ideal, I think I was expressing in that sense. And also, it's also, partially true, right, to some
Mm.
extent. But I
Or
really think
perhaps
what,
being paradigmatically agnostic. It's sort of like there isn't a right one. We've got to jump around. Yeah.
yeah, like you don't have commitments to one or the other. Like I have my favorites, I can tell
Yeah,
you that.
exactly. That's right. And that's where we're
And I
human
have,
beings, aren't we?
and I actually have ones that I have a proclivity for, not just
Yeah.
my favorites, like that bear the most fruit in this incarnation, something like that.
Yeah.
Just as people are born with 12 senses, and depending on the time and place and context of universal reality when you were born
Hmm.
or conceived, it's hard for me to say. I think it's born though, because I think it has to do with perception and the way in which we're constantly shaped by the world, not shaped for once and then just end up being a singular thing, like an oak tree is going to be an oak tree. Um, but just as we have sensory proclivities based on or sensitivities, it could be double-edged sword, right? It could be the thing that just grates you, or it could be the thing that opens the damn world up for you. So, but with the 12 worldviews, you actually have to have commitment to them in order to privilege one over the other. But it also has to do with characterological predisposition. So
Yeah.
it's a complex factor, and you can understand that there might be beings who aren't bound by their characterological dispositions and can go through the wheel of
Yeah.
perspectives. And in fact, that's what they are doing. And maybe even creating the damn wheel in the first place. Um, so I think that's beautiful. I think we should take up the 12 worldviews at some point too. Like I'm keen on that, but I'd need to be in the state that I'm in right now
Yeah.
to really get it. You know what I mean?
It's tough, but I
Because
think
you
we
have to
can bring.
understand the seven moods and the seven life processes. I really think that that's part of that whole process.
I think we can bring in one of another favorite topic of yours, one of your characterological dispositions, if we put it like that. It's like kairos, because there's another interest. So we talk about these worldviews, but we are also beings that live in time. And I remember many decades ago, or several decades ago, I'm not that old, but several decades ago, it's like reading this idea that's like in our early years, like in the 20s and 30s, 10s, 20s and 30s, there is a general tendency in a human being to be luciferic. And then so like past this like the midpoint of life, uh, then there is a stronger tendency for Aramanic to it's like to permeate the souls. So this worldview of perspectives is like it's important, but there are also lots of other rich factors going on in there, and time is this quality of time and recognizing that there at certain stages in life it's more natural to be sort of like in certain worldviews and viewing the world from certain perspectives. It's not dogmatically fixed, but I think you can talk about, and it's like in an average population it's more likely to be the case. But the world is also full of people who don't it's like follow those averages.
Well, there's also the needs of the time,
Yeah.
and we're all serving the needs of the time. Like the time, they're beings of time, and they are part of the just as we orchestrate our life through time. I mean, I don't know of any other creatures that may have watches, or train schedules,
Yeah.
right? Or uh, they don't need them, right? Because they have enough sense to go to bed when it's dark, and they have enough sense to perceive morphogenic fields so they can return the exact place that they were spawned over 1,000 miles of travel through upstream water, that sort of thing, like that. But we just have a different relationship with these things,
That's right.
and there's a time that's right for things, and there's a time we're placed in this world to uh, um, You know, it's funny. I think about this. I'm thinking about this as we're talking. Michael, I don't believe Michael Levin would cotton to much of what we're saying. I think it would be he would find it speculative or irresponsibly scientifically, or and maybe not. Maybe there's something underlying that impish character that actually is is uh, is uh, is knowingly, engaged in this stuff underneath it all. But he single-handedly brought me close, in much more intimately uh, not engage, intimately understanding of karma and reincarnation, like
Mhm.
like as real, like it's not a joke, like because it's exactly biologically as Steiner describes karma and reincarnation, as he describes the process by which organisms um, continue with their perspective and leave the thought content behind, so to speak.
Mhm.
Right? We can't take the thought content with us, but the perspective that we've gained is the perspective that then will enter into a new possibility the next
Mhm.
time, something like that. And so I need to remember that when we're dealing with the 12 worldviews, and it's more available with the 12 senses, because you think, well, why is my son, right? Let's say my daughter is a Virgo, and so she's very sensitive to touch, and but she's also very to the, you were talking about opposites. The opposite of touch is the sense of the other,
Mhm.
right? Right? Just like material and spirit are opposites. The sensory perceptual network um, is in relationship in similar complementary ways, and they're sort of eh, eh, they're sort of in reciprocal determination.
Mhm.
The more in touch you become with yourself, for example, the more sure you are in the world as you come into touch with other people, right? This sort of thing. That's a brilliant reality, and uh, so there's a destiny associated with what she needs to achieve based on that, right? And so that this is that doesn't even get into the role of Christ in karma, but it has something to do with this evolutionary individuation process. I can say that, and the timing, right? The
Yeah.
timing of what are the needs of our time,
Yeah.
and I don't know that you and I are touching on the very vein of what of the zeitgeist of our time, but we're some cobbling existence together that is trying to contribute, sees the relevancies, and it's not nothing that our viewership for the last one doubled after this advent of the Christian um what uh, uh the proliferation of attention on religious conversion, say.
Mhm. I think we're going to have to call this video "War in Heaven." It's like homage to Zach Stein, and you bring it in there because I I think this is what we're trying to capture, and it's like and bring to life that this something really serious is going on in our time, and we need lots of voices contributing to it, and yeah, um, and to make sure the right guys win this war as well.
Yes, well, and if we want more viewership, apparently if we use the term Christian, we'll be in good shape too.
Yeah, yes, yeah, that's right. Shall we knock it on the head there?
Yeah, let's knock her out.
Bang. Okay, cool.